All right. Hey, hey everybody. Welcome to this special Zoom broadcast. Uh, it's hosted by us and co-hosted by Humanists of Houston and Houston Atheists. Really important topic. Today is the 4th of June, 2020. And for anyone watching in the future, for some reference, things are really tense in the USA right now. A couple of events happened in a row, culminating with George Floyd's death, say murder, more accurately, that has resulted in protests, peaceful protests, riots, a lot of strife, and basically tension in this country. So social justice, white supremacy, racism has all kind of come to the fore. So we put this together, and we're very, very lucky to have Mandisa Thomas to come and be our special guest and give her wisdom on this topic. We've been getting a lot of questions as to, as white people, as allies, what can we do to help? And that's going to be a big part of what the wisdom that she gives to us. Also to let us know kind of how we got to where we are now. It's a big history lesson. But luckily, Mandisa's a history buff. She's an all-around badass. So again, we're very lucky to have her. I'm not gonna go on. Quick introduction. She is the president and founder of Black Nonbelievers, based out of Atlanta with multiple chapters around the country. So without further ado, I'm going to get out of her way and let Mandisa do her thing.
Thank you very much, Will. And thank you to you and the Houston area groups for putting this together. And thank you for everyone who is joining us this evening and for everyone who will watch this in the future. So like Will said, my name is Mandisa Thomas, and I'm the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia. And some of you may be wondering how we got to this point. Not just in the United States, but across the world. We're seeing now other countries, people in other countries stand in solidarity, protesting and saying Black Lives Matter. This has reached a global movement since 2013, this particular resistance movement. And now it is at a crucial point in visibility due to the very recent killings of Black men, women, and trans people in the United States. And there are some of us across the country, I would say some of you, because I'm going to give a bit of background. And, I'm going to give a bit of background on myself. I don't come from a particularly scholarly perspective. It's not going to be overly academic, but as Will stated in the beginning, I'm a history buff. Just in my capacity as an atheist, an organizer, a mom, and everything else, and just generally how I am, I like to have informed perspectives. And it is going to be good for us, hopefully starting this evening, that we start that process. So to give a bit of background on myself, I'm a New York City native, born and raised in New York City. And I'm 43 years old, soon to be 44. So I'm a child of the 70s, the 1970s. And for those of you who may be old enough to remember, I mean, I was certainly born in that time, but there was a shift in the Black community. There was a shift towards identifying with Afrocentricity, Black pride, and resistance. There was resistance back then as well to what was going on in the United States. So my parents made the conscious decision to not raise my brothers and I Christian, and two, to name my brothers and I African names and names that we identify with the continent. And so with that, and with us not being raised religious, we had an education and received a lot of information about Black history and culture growing up. And we learned a lot about systemic racism and injustice and the structural issues within the United States, which I would say kind of gave us an advantage over a number of people from a lot of backgrounds in this country. Because as I talk to people today, there's a lot of information that I learned growing up that some people may have only learned as of yesterday. And it does make a difference where you were born in this country, as well as the neighborhood you may have been raised in and the people you were around. So even though we did not create these structures as individuals, it's important to understand them and know what we can do at this time, to help each other, to help the people affected by these issues, whether it is collectively or individually. And so, yes, like Will said, we have to take a look back here because we don't ever get to a point like this without a buildup. And this starts here. Now we could go back into history if you're into history like I am, or if you ever paid attention in social studies class, whether it was elementary school through your through your college, your collegiate years. You would have learned that resistance movements are nothing new. It's nothing new to mankind, and it usually stems from us just being human beings. And as human beings, there are nations and countries who have conquered each other, cultures, and there's always been conflict as well as building. And we see this throughout world history. Um, However, when we are talking about um, the relations, the issues of the Black community as well as other marginalized communities and people of color, we cannot get around the fact that colonialization and European, the European countries conquering of other countries and continents has played a huge role in white supremacy and how we view things today. So I'm going to jump to for better understanding. For those of you who aren't familiar with the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of Africans in North America and particularly in the United States, it is important to learn a bit more about that to understand uh, the enslavement and the cruel enslavement, how many people lost their lives, and also just the economic effect and how it basically built the United States. And so, in order to get this massive number of Africans that were brought over, after the indigenous populations were decimated by the Spanish conquistadors or Spanish murderers. It is important to understand that Africans were brought over to help build this, this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, if you will. And so as we are, so it's important to understand that and how the structure of racism was created. So in order to have a system for accounting and also class and classification purposes, the concept of race was created and it was enacted into law to designate certain races, and of course, that of course established Black for the Africans who were darker. Now there were other classifications based on any mixing of races, which was usually classified as rape. As enslaved women gave birth to children of white masters. So that's a whole nother aspect there. So it was enacted into law the classifications of race, and that was to that was definitely for those classification purposes and for property purposes, or because slaves, the enslaved Africans, even according to the even at the time of the Declaration of Independence, enslaved Africans were not considered human beings. And again, we're talking about simply for the purposes of, not simply for the purposes of, if you're looking at it from a, just a financial perspective. At that time, slaves were considered property, they were worth money, so therefore they were not considered human. But when it comes to, actually, there was also a process to make sure that the enslaved knew they were enslaved, and that every piece of identity had to be stripped from them. Now we're talking about stripping my ancestors and some of our ancestors of their African identities, and actually justifying this through the cruel treatment and justification from the Bible and also legislation. So it wasn't just about the physical enslavement. And we must understand that the Catholic Church actually sanctioned the human slave trade and human trafficking for the purposes of the enslaved to be perpetually enslaved. And we have to understand this, because this means that today, it was never meant for Black folks to ever be free. We were supposed to be enslaved for eternity. And in doing and in this process, um, in stripping away the identities of, the enslaved Africans, and the treatment, the cruel treatment, much of the times, of Africans, um, there was a lot that went into, once you can deem someone, or a different, or people that don't look like you, or for the purposes of, of treating them less than or lower than because their skin is darker, that is etched into the psyche of not just the enslavers, but also the enslaved. So here comes this perpetual cycle of seeing the enslaved as inferior, as less than, which has not only been acted legally, but also in the psyche of people. Now, that isn't, now let's, just like I said before, that there were always resistance movements. There were many enslaved, and also the descendants, or the children of slaves, or the enslaved, who revolted, because one cannot oppress and subjugate a group of beings for too long without people fighting back. And certainly there was resistance during the, on the way over, as well as when the enslaved Africans arrived to this part of the world. So there is a long history, even from enslavement until now, of the descendants of Africans resisting their enslavement and their oppression. However, of course, during that time where, the psychological effects have come in, and we also note a lot of how religion was used to mentally subjugate. But that's not the issue, that's going to be a minor issue that I'm touching on right now, because we have to understand this system of institutional racism, and how we got to this point, why there are so many racial tensions. So we got here, first because of the because of the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of Africans. We also got to this point because once slavery legally ended in 1865, And there was a period, the Reconstruction period, where some of the enslaved were freed, some with not much resources, but there were also some who were freed and were allowed to become, they became Congress persons, they became business owners and homeowners and such. So there was a period of, there was a period of, progression. And I will also go back to say that the mental conditioning of many of the enslaved was to also keep them from uprising, because the white slave owners were outnumbered by the enslaved. So of course you don't want them rebelling. You need for folks to be conditioned to do what you need them to do. Um, but fast forwarding back to the Reconstruction era, and once that ended, we had the Jim Crow laws that were enacted. And we also had a terrorist group known as the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which actually prided itself on being a Christian organization, which went around effectively inflicting violence and terror and murder on Black folks. And so you had the Jim Crow laws where blacks were considered, they had to be separate from whites, but also put into conditions that were inferior and more subhuman. And this goes still back into the psyche of looking at Black folks as being inferior by the white collective. So and in that, of course, now everything was supposed to have been separate but equal, but we know that isn't the case, because there was already an economic disadvantage from the enslaved being freed without any resources, or with little to none, or the ones that were able to build up something for themselves. It was destroyed in what? Riots. It was destroyed by white people in riots and what they called lynch mobs. And there was a period of time where lynching was quite common, the lynching of Black folks, and it could be from something as very small as a white person thought you were looking at them wrong. And I will say also that there were many members of the Ku Klux Klan in law enforcement, in political positions, and in other positions of authority. So you had people in authority that were, that had the ability to further suppress and oppress Black folks, as well as those who stood with them. Now, it also must be we also must remember that while women got the right to vote through the suffrage movement in the early 1920s, Black folks did not get the right to vote until the 1960s, when the Voting Rights Act was passed. So now we are going through periods of from the late 1800s to the 1960s, in which the lynchings continued, but also the resistance continued, and we saw that through the Civil Rights Movement. And through that, we saw some progress after, once the Voting Rights Act was passed and certain things were passed. However, when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered in 1968, of course, this sparked an uproar, along with other Black leaders. Malcolm X was murdered in 1965. There are a number of leaders who were terrorized and murdered back then, but that's a conversation for another day. So you have these, you have the constant, degradation and acts of terror committed against Black folks. And once Dr. King died, there was more unrest. In the late 60s, there were another set of riots that went on across the country, because, Black folks were actually, at that point, racism became more de facto. So it wasn't legal, but it was more of, well, you knew, or you were going to be relegated to a certain place because you couldn't live in a white neighborhood, or you couldn't get caught in a certain area of town, if or at a certain time, if you were a person of color, if you were Black, because something bad would happen to you. Even in the most liberal of cities, even in areas in the country like Los Angeles and California, where you wouldn't think that that racism existed, and it really did. And this is one of the reasons why Los Angeles and California has had a history of rioting and uprisings, because our tendency to forget historical information tends to have us thinking that these things are only relegated to certain areas of the country, like the South. So throughout the years, as Black folks and as other people of color progressed in certain areas, there was still we still have this psyche or this psychosis of what it means to be profiled because you're Black, to be denied certain opportunities because you're Black, as has historically occurred, to not have access to more opportunities because you're Black, whether that is due to economic reasons or even deliberate. And so there's no wonder why there's always been this resistance. And we see this every day in our society where there is imagery of white supremacy everywhere. There is still the white dominant culture that we're dealing with that has always made Black folks and others to try to feel inferior, and that we've always had to fight against. And that is also turned internal. So we got to this point because there are a number of people who refuse to acknowledge that these things have happened, for one. We've gotten here because there were a number of people. There are folks who say, well, um, peaceful resistance is the only way to make things happen or for things to improve. And history has shown that that isn't necessarily the case. That's ideal, but that isn't always the case. There is also a history, whether or even the psyche of what people think about Black folks. And that could be a subconscious thing, and that is where privilege comes in. We also get here by the number of people who think that since slavery is over and that since the civil rights era is over, that things have that everything is all well and good, and it isn't. There are a number of people who think that because we've now had an African American president, that racism is over. And I think now at this current administration, we know that that isn't the case. We are also here now because we have an emboldened evangelical administration that is unapologetic in its treatment of people, which also and also enacting policies that do affect more people of color and more Black folks more than anyone else. Um, Also, too, we we get here by people thinking that, well, um, things that pertain to to Black folks don't necessarily apply to me. And that certainly is, or a lot of people take on this, well, it's not my problem, until it's in your face. And in this year, which has been a very, very challenging and daunting year, with the COVID-19 pandemic, it is certainly one of the worst that we've seen in our lifetime. And as we see that there are communities of color and Black communities who have been impacted and severely affected, um, by this pandemic, with the number of deaths being higher, and also systemically and historically, the mistreatment of Black folks by law enforcement and also by the structural system of this United States, it was bound to be a powder keg. And I think it's important now that it's good that we're in this age of information, in this age of technology, to where we can hopefully now come to solutions that will be that will ultimately help us in this country and hopefully really start to overturn this systemic racism and injustice that people, that my ancestors and my peers, and hopefully that have endured, that my children won't have to. And granted, I will say that I've never experienced um, personally the actual physical enslavement, or have had to endure the years of segregation, and I'm fortunate that I'm fortunate for that. However, those lessons have never been learned, never been lost on me, and I think it's important that this information and this history, that that is in the history of this country, and its mistreatment, and not just mistreatment, but its oppression of the Black community as well as other marginalized communities, is something that should not be lost on us. I mean, I do think that I am, I don't consider myself a patriot to this country, because again, knowing the history of how people were oppressed and mistreated and were put at a disadvantage, which does steep down through generations. Um, yes, this is something that we all must consider, and it will take a number of folks who've never had to share this experience, who've never had to experience this, and who've never had to think about it, to actually consider what it is like. And when you look at the history of murders within the Black community at the hands of law enforcement, there's way too many. The names of the people who were killed this year, um, is just a number of a long line of people who were murdered, who were lynched and murdered at the hands of white authorities, or at the hands of authorities, and it's far too many, because the way that, and we can also see this within our incarceration system, and who is adversely affected. So there are a number of systems here that need to change. And so at times I know it feels helpless. If you are someone who is Black, and yes, you are in the presence of law enforcement, or if you are in the presence of certain white people, you feel this trepidation. You feel this apprehension, because you never know whether it's going to mean your life. And when you have to go through life thinking about that, it certainly makes you it is not a good, it's like we're in a war zone. We think of war zones only being in what we consider third world countries. But if you are an average person living in a working class or poor neighborhood, that is a war zone. And a lot of the perpetrators are the ones who are supposed to be, that are ones that are in charge. And as we're seeing now with these instances of riots and unrest, and it turning to violence, we often see that it is aggravated by law enforcement, and that is due to the historical treatment of Black folks and people of color. And we can see this in the difference in um, how they are and how we are handled as opposed to others. And so these are things that, as a community that prides itself on our intellectual ability and our ability to research and understand these things as it pertains to state church separation, it's important to understand, for one, how the structure of racism came about, how it has affected all of us over the years, and how it still continues to affect us, even in your most liberal of areas. There are a lot of cities up in the Northeast. Now, Minneapolis is considered to be one of the most liberal cities, and Minnesota, I think, I understand, as I understand it, is a blue state. However, the murder of George Floyd is not the only one that has taken place in that city. You also had Philando Castile, who was murdered a few years back in that same city. And I've been, I've traveled to the city a few times. I think it's a very nice city. Um, However, the structural and also the psychosis of racism and how Black folks are treated has not gone away. And this is something that must be examined not just by residents, but also your local officials, your state officials, and also all the way up to the government. But it has to start local because, and also as we put this country puts a lot of resources in the military, which goes a lot, which goes which goes hand in hand with how people are treated, and it's not always treated with the sense of rehabilitating or bringing about a clinical change. It is more to punish, and when you have a society that looks to punish more than rehabilitate, then you have these problems. And so from here there is a lot that I think that we can benefit from by having definitely a more secular government, as well as us being able to look at this issue not just from how do we get here to why are we here right now, but understanding the totality of it, understanding how we got how this started, but also where we are now, where we are now. Now I can't say that it is completely a it is a broken system. There are still laws on the books that are archaic in the United States, in different cities, that are extremely archaic and should be done away with. And it is really about time. And there are some people who feel like, well, the system can't be changed. It was a system constructed by people. It is a system that can be deconstructed by people, but it's going to take the people to really take these long, hard looks and use their skills and expertise to understand these aspects, and and what we can all do about them, and not just seeing them from a privileged or intellectual point of view. I consider myself a practical humanist. I'm not a theoretical humanist. I think education and information is absolutely important. But I also assert that just because someone is educated, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're informed. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they engage well. And that's a huge misconception. That's also how we got to this point. Um, Still enacting a hierarchical system of who we might be better than. And oftentimes, people of color and Black folks in particular often fall at on the receiving end of that mistreatment. Again, whether it's overt or subconscious. And it is time for so many of us to re-examine what has been taking place. Also understand why this movement is at its forefront. Understanding that again, it is not personal, but we must. It is also important to understand that white supremacy and how it has affected the structural and institutional things in our society, how we see each other and how we see the world. And until we start seeing each other, now it's we do know that yes, race is a human, it is a social construct, but it is a racist construct, and it's gonna take for folks to understand that part. So not wanting to talk about it isn't going to help. We have to talk about it. We have to learn about it. We have to understand how this came about. Black folks didn't start it, but it is important for us to know how it came about, and also what the steps that we can do. And it didn't happen overnight. which means it won't end overnight. It will take time. It took time to build, or it took time to put these things in place. It took time for these ideas to be seeped into our psyche, and it has been passed down through generation. And but as we move into this new age, where we now see a lot of black and white folks and other and people from different backgrounds actually standing together on this same Black Lives Matter. There are a lot of people who think that, and there have always been white people and folks who objected and fought against the oppression and subjugation of other human beings. And so understanding these movements, what we can learn from them historically and how we can apply them today is going to be one step in turning this around. And these issues that we face, the issues that the Black community face, what women face, what other people of color face, the LGBTQ community face, they all intersect because separation of church and state is often religious ideals tend to be at the forefront of these structures. And just as we rally against that and we try to build community out of being indoctrinated or overcoming that indoctrination, it's important to understand how it has affected other areas of our lives and other communities. So it goes well beyond what we think this activism is supposed to be. So guess what? Black lives should matter to everyone, because as human beings, Black lives should matter, because historically and even currently, our lives haven't mattered. We have been expendable, whether it is physically or having contributions to our contributions to this country be overlooked and just outright erased. And it's important now that in our society, as we continue to progress and as we continue to unlearn and undo the things that we have learned, is going to be important for us to really take a long hard look, as I said before, re-examine what we've learned, re-examine our society and our structure, to make sure that we can make the best of this time. It is very tense. I doubt that it will be the last time we see this tension. But if we continue to repeat the same mistakes, if we continue to ignore these problems and act like they don't apply to us, or if we don't learn from the people who are working in who are working on these issues, and we can do them together. If we fail to do these things, we will continue to repeat the cycle. We will see it continue, and this is an opportunity now for us to really make some innovative changes, and to look towards a better future, not just for us, but definitely for our children and the generations that will come after us. So I will conclude this portion of the talk here. Thank you very much for joining in. There are a number of resources that you can find. I know Will has posted some. Um, you will There are a number, if you are interested in engaging and supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and organizations that work for people of color and Black folks. There are a number of organizations that you can support. So please do take a look, and we hope that you consider supporting our work. I say our work because at the heart of the work of Black nonbelievers is resistance. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandisa. And thank you very much. I'm going to kind of go through a few questions from both Facebook and the Zoom. First one, given that religion and spirituality has been and is a tool of survival for Black people, how does a non-believer receive inspiration in this oppressive system?
Well, I can't speak for all non-believers because right now it's trying. I don't think there's anything wrong with us saying at times that we feel like there is no inspiration. That's honest. It's honest for us to to say that. But I find my inspiration in a number of people who I have seen fight this fight, and people who, regardless of the situations that they're facing, they still get up and they care about their fellow human beings. And I will say that there are a number of non-believers, free thinkers, and atheists who are working in these movements. There have always been in resistance movements in the United States, and those who care about other human beings ultimately are inspirational to me. Also, you can find inspiration in perhaps the music you listen to. There are a number in some of the literature that you may read, whether it's books or what have you. There are other ways to be inspired other than your religious community, and in some ways that could be in conjunction with. Um, so yes, there are more than one ways to be inspired. I say being a non-believer and being an atheist is just the beginning. It is a start of a new beginning. It is a start of looking at things from multiple points of view. So you're not losing anything. You may feel like it, and it may feel like you have lost something when you have when you have when you let go of your religious beliefs. But there's so much of a there's so much of a bigger world out there that we can engage and participate and find inspiration from.
Right. A question from Anita on Facebook, yeah, for you. Is it fair to say that Black people have historically suffered from PTSD?
Yes, absolutely. And there has been no actual there's only been recently a focus on mental health within the Black community. And this does come from everything that I mentioned about being enslaved in this country, being oppressed in this country, and then having been released or freed from slavery just to endure the trials and tribulations of segregation, and having to deal with that. So yes, there are a number of Black folks, um, and there are still, and we have to remember that this is not far back in our recent history. There are still people alive who remember those days. They were horrific, and so yes, the Black community is definitely suffering. I would say many of us from a PTSD, whether we recognize it or not, and that is due to the mistreatment and the subjugation and oppression in this country. So many of us, whether we realize it or not, have been affected by it.
All right. And CV on Facebook is asking, do you find that the non-believer movement is growing within the Black community?
It is. And I will say that there's always been a history of people questioning religion and the church within the Black community. There are now more Black folks who are openly expressing their dissent with the church and religion, the God concept. And yes, there are more atheists who are coming out, so to speak. So yes, it is growing, and we again, because we are in an age of information, we can find other like-minded individuals who can relate to what we go through. So yes, there are more people coming out as a result.
And Lisa, thank you so much for this. We're going to open it up. Just if people have some want to get on video and ask in person, we're going to open it up in a few seconds. But um, Jesse has listed some organizations to support. If you have, I know money's kind of tight these days for everybody, but if you have money, uh, uh, consider donating to these organizations. I'm going to post some more and also some great books on this topic, some movies, podcasts, and such. So I'll send some information on the sites. Even just joining Black Nonbelievers, Black Lives Matter, just joining so that they have numbers. That with numbers they can have a little bit of clout. That also goes a long way. Sharing it on your page and sharing their stories. All this goes a long way with how you can help. Um, and again, Mandisa is wonderful. She does terrific work out there just as an activist, as a great human. I personally support. She has a Patreon page which I support because I want her to do well. Because if she does well, we do well. So I'm going to open it up and see if you guys have any want to get on video and have your voices heard. I guess wave your hand, kind of let us know if you're interested in asking a question.
So I know there's some. Uh-oh.
I'm trying to navigate.
I think I see one. I'm gonna unmute you.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
How you doing?
Good.
Hey, what's going on, Mandisa?
Hey, I know you.
Yes, I've been following you around everywhere lately. Yeah, so I've always been inspired by you. I don't know if you know that. I don't,
but thank you. I didn't.
So, you are out there, boots on the ground, doing stuff that I wish that I could do back in 2011. And while I attribute my kind of awakening to a particular person whose name won't be mentioned, I'm pretty sure you know who that is. The positive and very curt, very direct, very strong, and I'm just listing off attributes that I admire my own mother, maybe a coincidence there, that I see in you is inspiring, to repeat myself. But it is what's also refreshing is that the dedication you have, no matter the trials and tribulations. And that's why I will, every time I see something that you share, every time I see that you're alive, I'm on it, because now that I do actually have a platform, people for some strange reason listen to me. I want to make sure that they know that there is somebody who is much better than me, probably a little bit less petty, but there is somebody who you guys can go to if you want to know why Black organizations exist. Well, there's issues within a lot of these, are online and offline. There's a lot of issues, and you know what? It is refreshing. I can let my hair down in a sense when I am around other Black atheists, because I don't have to worry about code switching. I have to worry about this impression. Just not even 20 minutes ago, I had some random white atheist tell me, well, I thought you were better than that. No, sir. I follow my characteristics that I've literally shown the entire time you've ever watched me on YouTube for years. You don't know me. So I've never had a Black atheist ever come to me with that kind of energy, because they accepted who I was and not what they thought I should be. And I think that that's something that can't be overstated at any point in time, right? So that is why I will continue to support Black Nonbelievers, being that, other atheist groups that are Black tend not to work out for me very well anyway.
and this also, thank you, Dragnot, because this goes to, I'm going to try to keep this brief, but there is a history of with us being subjugated and having to, quote unquote, have this place in this country, and how when people see us, and they still see us as the psychology of seeing us as being inferior, so that when there are Black folks who they see as being a bit better than the others, they're imparting their own biases and also racist perceptions, because we've always had to play into these respectability politics, whether it's around white folks and even some other Black folks. So, and that's a part of the internal conditioning that that we still have to tackle even within our own communities. And so when people ask, why are there organizations like Black Nonbelievers? Why are there Black organizations? Because for one, we're still dealing with the systemic issues as well as the internal issues as a result of all of that. And this idea that we're also just supposed to pull ourselves up, even though we're at this disadvantage. And so having to navigate all of that, And I definitely, I know you and I have been connected since the beginning, has been great, because I know some folks who have come and gone, and I've always wished them well. But for me, that the activist in me, I was born with it. I was born with that revolutionary spirit, and that and having that pride in my people and our resistance and overcoming and working towards. So I'm always going to be bliggity black, no matter no matter who likes it or not. So that's never, that's always going to be the thing for me, is to make sure and I love some of everyone in this movement. I love I love the people who work with us without any expectation of getting something from us. We appreciate that, and I love working with many people in this community. But yes, my priority will always be us. So.
Hey, Mandisa, Perla on Facebook she's asking, what can we do to help move the stories of Black women to the forefront? Breonna Taylor, for example.
So continue to share yes, and that was I think the murder of George Floyd was the catalyst, absolutely, for the riots. But yes, the murder of Breonna Taylor and other Black women at the hands of law enforcement has been overlooked and outright erased. So it's important to continue to share the petitions, donate to any, to her family's fund. Also, continue to share, do research on Black women, women of color. Black Nonbelievers has produced a very wonderful conference along with Black Skeptics Los Angeles and women and the Women's Leadership Project, called Women of Color Beyond Belief. And you can find presentations from last year's conference on our channel. And we are very big on uplifting the voices of women. Yes, continue to, when you see when you see those incidents being shared, do continue to share them, and make sure people know, and let them also know how they can support these efforts.
All right, and Anita Torres is raising her hand. I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
Got it.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Yes. Hello.
Hi. One of the things that I've heard and understand that a lot of minorities and many Black people have said, hey, I don't want to have to educate you. You go educate yourself. And I completely understand that. That's great. But what is it about you that do you not have that reaction when people want to learn more?
It depends, because sometimes I do.
Okay.
There is a privilege that many white people have, that they think that those from oppressed communities or marginalized communities, and we see this in a lot of men too, a lot of white men, that they feel like, they're supposed to be spoon-fed that information, even though they have had the opportunity and the advantages of education and economics.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of us are asked about these issues, oftentimes at the cost of our intellectual labor. So there are a number of people who want to know about the issues that Black people go through, but they don't want to support the work. And it's like, okay, our ability to think and research is something that we pride ourselves on, especially as non-believers, as secularists. But the work that the work that it takes to do that, there's still a religious mindset and the patriarchal mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So it does become daunting. And I am someone who is very big on before I became a full-time activist in 2018, which is the reason why I have a Patreon and I go so hard for my organization. My background is in customer service and people engagement and hospitality. And there is a lot that the secular community and a lot of white people in particular need to learn about engaging other people, especially Black folks. Because if you've never had to engage someone who has gone through historic and systemic issues, then it's important to know how to engage us. And there are a lot of people who don't. They just come right at us thinking that we're just supposed to give them this information. And also at you know, and also with these with these perceptions and misconceptions that that they've had of us, and they're expecting us to just totally dispel them,
Right.
which just puts this undue and unfair burden on us that we've already had to deal with for years.
Right. Right. Well, I appreciate
But yeah.
your ability, at least when people are willing to educate and communicate.
Oh, absolutely. You know, part of it is that still that people engagement and that customer service and that hospitality and just love it. I mean, I absolutely love, you know, engaging people and talking with people. So I do think that, you know, that part is important. Now, I'll give you a piece of it. The rest of it, you'll either have to do, or if you want me to speak more on it, then you need to support. You need to put
Right.
put your money where your mouth is. So yes.
Right.
But I can
Cool.
tactfully say that though.
Okay. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
We have a hard stop at 8:30. One more question, and this is going to be the last question for the night. Christy from Facebook is asking, are there any specific police reforms that you think we should be advocating for?
I think definitely for the mental health of law enforcement officers.
Mhm.
Now, I will say that probably in their line of work that they see a lot of things that can wreak havoc on their mental state. And I think just as we push for mental health amongst civilians, there should definitely be more of more psychological checks and definitely more and then there definitely needs to be more accountability at that. You know, there needs to be more criminal accountability for officers who go well above the line to the point where they are murdering people, because oftentimes they get off with either a slap on the wrist or
Mhm.
not, or nothing happens to them at all because according to procedure they were in the right. So in implementing more mental health resources. And if that doesn't work, then moving towards more criminal actions against officers who are excessive in their use of force.
Wonderful. Mandisa, thank you so much again. This has been terrific. Thank you all for joining. I know this was your dinner hour, so thank you so much. I am going to post some more resources, some more books, and this is not the last you're going to hear about this. This is a long-term problem. It takes a long-term solution, so I'm going to keep bringing it up. Sorry, not sorry, but it has to happen. So expect that. Thank you, everybody, for coming and the questions. And I'm going to post some things. The conversation can continue online, and we would encourage it and welcome it. So thank you so much, guys. Guys, have a good night.